Please pray with me. May these words that I speak be grounded in my soul, encouraged by the God presence in me, and may these words that you hear be captured by your soul, enlivened by the God presence in you. Amen. Just before I begin, a couple things I want to mention. Last week we had a very, very long preamble, which is also in print and available at the back. And for those that weren't here, if you want to kind of get a bit more of the context of where we're going to be going over the next 14 weeks now, there are copies of that there, along with the sermon for this morning. The other thing I have to mention is one of the things we talked about last week was the significance of numbers in the Bible, and that it's not necessarily a historical account as much as using a number which is a strong symbol. And we talked about the 40 days that Jesus was in the wilderness, the 40 days that Noah was on the ark, the 40 years that the people were in the desert with Moses, and several other 40s. After church last Sunday, Joan or Bev came up to me, I think, but they had both been talking about that. You'll never guess how many footprints there are on that banner. There's 40. Not on purpose. They made 48, and 48 didn't fit. So the Spirit is at work. We have just heard 4 separate healing stories, 2 that I told the children and 2 that Dawn read about, the leper and the paralyzed man. These stories that initiate Jesus' mission in Galilee. The question is, what are we to make of these miraculous accounts, and what is Mark telling us about Jesus through these tales? The biblical scholar jury is out about the level to which Jesus could heal. Scholars are all over the map in trying to understand that. Most believe he was a healer. And the fact that Mark has no less than 13 healing stories in 16 chapters suggests that this was a very important part of Jesus' work and ministry. But the miraculous cures, the instant relief of paralysis, the instant disappearance of leprosy, those miraculous cures draw mixed reviews, particularly since we need to remember that miracles are never written in the present. They're always written about something that happened in the past, as are these stories. And this is true of the Old Testament miracle stories as well. Personally, I believe Jesus was a healer, a very powerful healer, although not necessarily a person who could cure outright. After all, that is not our understanding of what it means to be healed today. It's not necessarily about cure, and likely wasn't any different 2,000 years ago. And if we understand that Mark's gospel was in fact written as worship liturgy rather than historical narrative, then why would we treat the healing stories any different than any of the other stories? Wouldn't they too be intended to point us toward a greater truth about God, about the God that was met in this Jesus of Nazareth? And one of the clues, you see, for me is that Mark, once again in these stories, turns to Isaiah, this time to chapter 35, and I'll give you a few of those lines. You'll know this because we read this in the lectionary. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the speechless sing. And a highway shall be there, and it shall be called the Holy Way. The unclean shall not travel on it. Mark's healing stories, 13 of them, include 2 about sight restored, 2 about hearing restored, 2 about speech restored, 2 about wholeness restored, 1 about paralysis ended, and 4 evil spirits banished. covering all of Isaiah's predictions. I love it. Coincidence or just darn good worship liturgy? I believe these go much deeper than simply being healing stories, as Mark weaves Jesus' revolutionary messages, the things that would eventually get him killed, into seemingly harmless stories of miraculous healings. Jesus' conversion experience that we talked about last week, that led him into this ministry, this work for God, sprung up out of his growing awareness that God was loving and compassionate and could never be a vindictive, vengeful God that people needed to fear. I am absolutely convinced that Jesus understood God in that way. Jesus possessed a profound wisdom that changed the way he looked at the world. Rather than following the religious and political laws and rules blindly, he examined them carefully to determine whether or not they were just. Finding more often than not that they were created to control people rather than to attend to the health and well-being of each person, he stood against them in the name of love. This new way, this holy way, emboldened by the wisdom that helped him see God differently, is at the heart of the healing stories that we heard today. And the first clue is found in looking at where Mark sets the very first healing story. He goes right to the heart of the injustice, to the temple, the synagogue. He heals first in church. And as Jesus begins to speak, the people were astounded by his teaching. We don't know what he said because Mark doesn't tell us that. And yet, I think we know precisely what he said. Something like this: the temple is not the power nor the mediator for God. Each soul belongs to God and is worthy in its own right and has the power to embrace the Spirit of God. He might also have said something like, love and compassion trumps. I don't know if trumps was a word then, but whatever the equivalent was, love and compassion trumps laws, codes, and sacrifices. They were astounded because, like Jesus, once they saw the injustice that they endured themselves and collectively, they could not and would not go back. They wanted to follow this new way. Because of the wisdom of God that Jesus embodied, he was given authority by the people. And we hear that clearly in the reading this morning. Authority can never be taken. Authority always has to be given to someone. The common people saw the wisdom in Jesus and gave him authority. The priests and politicians saw the wisdom in Jesus and started the plot to have him killed. One man comes forward, this man in the story, and he says, "What do you have to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. You are the Holy One of God." And Jesus says, "Be silent." And that unclean spirit rushes out of the temple screaming. Once you see injustice, you can't go back, except kicking and screaming to try and keep the injustice in place. And we see it in this world all the time. We are told that Jesus then goes synagogue to synagogue, proclaiming the way. Mark then gives us 3 stories of Jesus healing illnesses. The common belief in the first century was that if someone was ill, it was because God was punishing you, either for something you did or something that your family did. And they believed that was how God worked. Mark is saying that Jesus didn't agree with this kind of God at all. Jesus' wisdom made clear to him that a God that is the very spirit of love and compassion would not also be a God that punishes. It's just not possible. We know this because of the stories of Simon's mother-in-law, a leper, and a paralyzed man. All three of these people are outcasts in their community, untouchable, and believed to be punished by God for something that they have done. And as a result, you don't go near them. You don't help them. They are shunned. Jesus restores life. He heals all three of them by restoring them to the community. A woman who lost her husband would be taken in by her son. That was the law. If she didn't have any sons, she was exiled. She was cast away. She was considered dead to the community. And usually she would die, either of starvation or exposure or something. That was the law. Simon obviously has compassion because as a son-in-law, he decides to take her in. It might have been a clue as to why Jesus chose him as one of the disciples. And of course, Jesus immediately seeing her, he doesn't care if she's a mother-in-law, if she's in exile. He takes her hand and he lifts her up and restores her to the community. And we know she's restored because the next line is, and immediately she began serving them, which she would never, and as awful as that is, I'm sorry about the sexist nature of it, the reality is in that community, for a woman to then be able to serve her family, restored her life. Then, right after that, Jesus is confronted by a leper, and it says, moved by compassion, he touches him. Jesus made himself unclean in the eyes of the law and the eyes of the church by touching this unclean man. This act brings honor to the leper and restores him to life in the community. It tells him that he is worthy of life, even with whatever disease he has. And then the whole series of three culminates in the story of the paralytic. And it comes full circle because we began in the temple, and now in this story, Jesus challenges the authority of the temple publicly. And how they figure they have the right to determine a person's fate. Jesus, by simply speaking with the authority that has been given to him by the people, the common people, restores life and honor to that paralyzed man. Whether he physically healed him or not is not of concern. It doesn't really matter. He was restored to life in the community. This is the way of God. This is the way Jesus lived. This is the path he called people to follow then, and he calls us to follow now. A way of wisdom rooted in love and compassion. Mark is telling us clearly that Jesus had no use for blind faith. No use for adherence to a religious doctrine just because. That wasn't good enough. And Jesus saw no value in going to synagogue or going to church if it did nothing to nurture your soul and change the way you live your life. Jesus is calling us to live every moment of our lives in the way of compassionate wisdom, so that we too become embodiments of God's Spirit. This is not an easy road. It's not. It means changing many of the ways that we behave day to day. It means being willing to be vulnerable and open to each other every day. It means being willing to make hard decisions every day. Our current political climate is a perfect example of the change that I believe we are being called to make. Most politicians today, and I don't care about the stripe, most politicians today will say that we can't do any more about poverty, about homelessness, about teen suicide, about healthcare failings, about education challenges. We can't do anything about those, just to name a few, until we grow the economy. In other words, they're saying we can't be compassionate until we can afford it. But Jesus is saying we can't wait. We have to make those hard decisions because we can't afford not to be compassionate. Sorry for the double negative. Or in other words, we need to be compassionate whether we can afford it or not. The wisdom of only looking after each other when we can afford it is not and never will be God's wisdom. The irony is that study after study shows us that we are not happier when we can afford it. On a happiness or contentment scale, people in developing countries beat us hands down time after time, and they can't afford it. Jesus' way, I believe, is the way to real contentment, real happiness. If that weren't true, he wouldn't have been followed so easily. And he wouldn't have been loved so deeply that thousands, literally tens of thousands, would have been willing to die for the life they came to know and live because of him. A life restored, a life healed. We need to stop and notice what needs healing and restoring in our own lives. We need to encourage others, wherever they are and however we are connected to them, to be open to healing, that their lives might also become whole. Yes, my friends, the way is clear. As followers of the way, our journey is into the very heart of what it is to be human. To open to the power of love to make us whole, restored. And I believe it can happen for each of us, for each and every one of us, because Jesus heals.